Hello, I am Mark Ryder, and I'm the Soils and Nutrient Management Extension Specialist with Virginia Cooperative Extension and Virginia Tech, located on the Eastern Shore at the Eastern Shore Agricultural Research and Extension Center. Today I wanted to discuss some nutrient needs for high-yielding vegetable crops here in Virginia, and especially focus on some of the needs as far as fertilizer requirements and some things to consider as far as nutrients that we need for these high-yielding vegetable crop production systems. One thing we wanted to discuss today is increasing fertilizer use efficiency in Virginia for our vegetable crop production systems. The best way to illustrate this is using Liebig's law of the minimum, which dictates that the nutrient or item in most short supply in your crop production system will be what limits your plant growth, your yield, and overall potential vegetable quality. So using this theory is certainly the best way to get the most bang for your buck in your vegetable crop production system, but it also allows us to focus on the right fertilizer and the right nutrient to make sure that we're not just wasting money, we're not potentially over applying the nutrients, and that we're really focusing on what can make meaningful crop production changes, at least related to fertilizer management. So in this diagram, we see that water is the most limiting slat, or the most limiting thing in this crop production system. If we fix this lowest slat of water, which we easily and typically do in our vegetable crop systems, the most limiting thing that we need to focus on in this scenario, in this case, is nitrogen. Nitrogen's the lowest slat, so we need to patch that hole and then focus on the next lowest item. So we fix water with irrigation, we fix nitrogen with fertilizer, so this slat is no longer lowest. And in this example, potassium is now the next lowest item, or maybe calcium, depending on the height. They're about the same, it looks to me. But this is really the mechanism that we use in soil fertility and nutrient management to make sure that we're not over applying, but we are focusing on the correct nutrient for crop growth. And this is really important regardless of your system here in Virginia. So one thing I like to do to really indicate why fertilizer is so important, because typically, especially in vegetable crop production systems, fertilizer is not a big part of your overall production budget. Certainly labor is typically the most expensive item, but fertilizer is overall inherently important for ensuring that we have optimum yields. So in this table, we have our crop, a typical high yield here that we can achieve in Virginia with optimum conditions, our nitrogen uptake, our nitrogen that is actually removed in whatever particular yield we're talking about, our phosphate or P2O5 that's taken up in the plant for that yield, how much of that phosphate is removed, how much potassium or K2O or potash is taken up in that plant, and how much potash is removed with that yield. And why this is so important is because, as you can see, if you're yielding very optimum yields, like in tomatoes, if you're yielding 40 tons per acre, 70, 80,000 or so tons per acre, you are removing a lot of nutrients. So for instance, a 40-ton tomato yield would take up 232 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and 100 pounds of that nitrogen would actually be removed in that harvestable tomato fruit. Likewise, 87 pounds of P2O5 is taken up, and 68 pounds of P2O5 is removed. 463 pounds of K2O is taken up for an 40-ton yield, and 288 pounds of that is removed. So with this, we can clearly see that fertilizer certainly is important. But one other thing I want you to note when looking at this is how these nutrients are certainly not in a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. So what I mean by that is, if you look at nutrients that are removed with harvest and that we might want to simply replace with fertilizer, that for every 1 pound of P2O5 that is removed, we have removed 1.5 pounds of nitrogen and 4.2 pounds of potash per acre. And this is specifically looking at tomatoes. So the reason I bring this up is that, let's say you're using a common fertilizer like a 10-10-10 or say a 20-20-20. If you're looking to simply replace nutrients that you have removed with this fresh market tomato crop of 40 tons per acre, that is not the appropriate fertilizer to use, because we have removed a different ratio. We have not removed a 1-1-1 ratio. We have actually removed a 1.5-1-4.2 ratio. So about a 1.5-1-4 ratio, meaning that we need a lot more potassium to be replaced in that system to keep it equal, which cannot be achieved using a 1-1-1 ratio. So what will happen over time is, if you are using these, say, 10-10-10 or 20-20-20 and applying them on a potassium or K basis, you're actually over applying phosphorus, which certainly may not hurt anything as far as yields or fruit quality, but you are ultimately wasting money and increasing your soil test phosphorus above concentrations that you really need to. So one thing we like to do to really get a handle from the extension side of things for our overall soil fertility needs is to look at these soil test summaries that have been averaged through the many samples sent through Virginia Tech over a time period. So what I have displayed on the screen now is a northern coastal plain, which would include, say, the Middle Peninsula and Northern Neck areas, the coastal plain region of Virginia, over the years 2018 through 2020 so far. And what we have found is that overall, we are pretty typical to the rest of the coastal plain areas of Virginia as far as needs, as far as pH, phosphorus, and potassium ratings. So looking at our soil test summaries, we're not going to cover pH today, but looking over at these commercial farm operator samples, there were over 10,000 sampled during this 3-year time. Around 35% of those need lime, which makes sense as far as our typical 3-year lime regimen that we typically see here in Virginia. And about 5% of those samples had a pH that was too high, above 7.0. So in these pHs that are too high, we certainly don't want to lime, but might also need to consider some micronutrient issues. But especially looking at these fertilizer ratios that we've talked about, around 32% or so are low or medium for phosphorus, while 36% of these farmer samples were testing very high for phosphorus, meaning they do not typically need more phosphorus for crop growth. Looking at potassium, 66% of the samples were low or medium, meaning we need potassium fertilizer, and just 4% were in this very high, meaning they didn't need samples. Now, this was average for all commercial farms here in the northern coastal plain area of Virginia. But I went through and looked at the vegetable crop codes, which I'm not going to display the data here because I didn't want to get too specific targeting certain crops in this specific soil test summary. But one thing to note is that vegetable crops typically have high to very high soil test phosphorus soil test concentrations, meaning that over time we are applying more phosphorus than we need. And a lot of this can be attributed to using this 1 ratio fertilizer, like a 10-10-10 or 20-20-20. So what we're targeting and what we hope to do is to really start having producers use fertilizers that hone in on exactly what they need for crop growth, so they can apply more potassium, which is typical, and reduce the amount of overall phosphorus concentrations that they need. Something else to note from looking at this soil test summary is that we have no real soil test calibrations for nutrients like nitrogen or sulfur, and we don't have very refined calibrations for calcium and magnesium and so forth, which we commonly see in our soil test reports. So something else we're working towards, and something I'll show you some data today regarding, is some of these other nutrients that are not readily found on our soil test report. On the previous slide, I mentioned that we do not have a soil test concentration recommendation per se for sulfur for many reasons, and one is historically sulfur was not needed as part of our overall soil test because we were receiving significant concentrations of sulfur deposited for free on us per year from acid rain. So certainly this was good for crop production because coincidentally we had somewhere between 15 to 20 or so pounds of sulfur per acre being deposited on us per year, which coincidentally is also around what we need for typical row crops here in Virginia, as well as vegetable crops. However, with the implementation of the Clean Air Act, since 2000 to say 2012 to 2014, we've seen a significant reduction of this free sulfur being rained down on us. And we are now seeing sulfur issues crop up in many crops across Virginia. And this is also holding true for vegetable crops. One reason we might see some sulfur issues is because, especially in the main vegetable production areas on the eastern side of the state, we're in the coastal plain where we're sandy. And with sand, of course, comes leaching potentials. And so this is a Bojack sandy loam soil profile, which is typically found in many areas across eastern Virginia, and especially here on the eastern shore. But certainly on the northern neck, we have very similar type soils where we're somewhere upwards of 65% sand or so in our upper horizon. Now with this potential comes a very easy system for anions like nitrates, and in this case sulfates, to leach down deeper into the soil profile. And so of course sulfur fertilizer applied one year may not be readily available to vegetable crops in the following year if we've had significant rainfall potential. One thing we've discussed throughout extension talks in Virginia, and as we demonstrated in 2016 at the Ag Expo site down in Dinwiddie County, as well as some expo sites around other places in Virginia, is that sulfur certainly does leach in our profile and is often caught in the heavier clay soil textures down deep, say maybe 20 to 25 inches, depending on where you are in Virginia, how deep your soil is. It may be upwards of 7 ppm in the 0 to 6 inch range, 9 ppm is say the 6 to 12 inch range, which is coincidentally around where 90% of our vegetable roots are located, which is not enough for crop production. But as you go deeper, sulfur concentrations can increase to 30 to 65 ppm or so, which is ample for crop production. However, as I mentioned, vegetable crops roots just don't get that deep. So certainly sulfur is something we need to consider as far as an additional nutrient, since our upper horizons are typically leached out here in the coastal plain. Now inversely, looking at phosphorus, phosphorus does not leach typically. And so in this example, phosphorus is 76 ppm in this upper horizon in the 0 to 6, which is pretty adequate for growing most vegetable crops. Phosphorus does decrease as the soil profile goes deeper, but the roots are not getting down there anyway. And potassium, likewise, typically does not leach unless you're really sandy or you put on more than the soil can hold in this upper horizon. And in our case in this pit, we did find that potassium concentrations did increase as we went deeper. But again, vegetable crop roots are not going that deep. So we wanted to focus on some work looking at polyethylene mulch systems, which could be used, in our case, we use fresh market tomatoes here on the Eastern Shore, to really look at some of these nutrients that might be limiting and where we don't have traditionally very good extension recommendations for them. So we wanted to improve our recommendations. And as we develop these recommendations, as always, they'll be implemented throughout the Virginia Tech Soil Testing Program, as well as outlined in the Mid-Atlantic Commercial Vegetable Production Recommendations, which is Virginia Cooperative Extension Publication SPS-193 this year. So one thing you'll notice, one difference this year is that we have a 2020-2021 combined edition, but we are going to put out early 2021 some updates for some issues that we've seen to fix a few problems. But overall, the guide will pretty much be the same. So if you want a free copy of this, certainly navigate to our website here and you can find a free PDF version of this guide. But specifically looking at this Mid-Atlantic guide recommendations for, I'm going to use fresh market tomato as my example here. One thing I wanted you to note is if you're looking at fertilizer recommendations based on soil tests, that there is very little need for a fertilizer ratio that's a 1-1-1, such as a 10-10-10 fertilizer or a 20-20-20 fertilizer. Also, one thing I want you to note is that we're very limited on the guidance for sulfur, calcium, and magnesium in this guide. So again, that's something we're working on. And thirdly, one thing I want you to note is that in this guide, especially for phosphorus and potassium, we overall have a 0 recommendation here if your soils test very high. However, this is a Mid-Atlantic guide, so there's several states at play that consult to form this guide. And what we have done and what we have found is that in Virginia, we do see nice yield responses to some starter fertilizers for phosphorus and potassium, even if our soil is testing very high. So in this case, you'll see a footnote for most of these crops, in this case, polyethylene mulch fresh market tomato. If you're testing very high, we have a 1 footnote, and in the bottom of this table, we see that in Virginia, crop replacement values of 50 pounds of P2O5 and 50 pounds of K2O per acre are recommended on soils testing very high. Because we have seen a nice yield response, and because these values are still lower than what you typically would remove from that crop production system with high yielding vegetable crops. Therefore, you're not further increasing your overall soil test values, and it is a safe overall recommendation if you're worried about water quality. However, something else I wanted you to take a note at is the overall ratios of what fertilizers are needed. So in most soils, and if you think back to that table I showed, like for an average soil test value for vegetable crops, we would say we would need a total of 150 to 210 pounds of nitrogen per acre as a fertilizer, mixed between mixing it into the bed and fertigation. A lot of our soils test it very high for phosphorus, meaning we would just need this 50 pounds of P2O5 per acre. And a lot of our soils test it medium for potassium, meaning we would need 200 pounds of K2O per acre. So taking a look at this general overall fertilizer recommendation, it's pretty clear to see that we need fertilizers that are not in a 1-1-1 NPK fertilizer ratio. So what does this mean? So a 1-1-1 ratio fertilizer, like say a 20-20-20, would work in our case if you have one specific condition occurring. And the one specific condition where a 20-20-20 is adequate, is applicable, is if you're applying 50% of your nitrogen prior to laying your plastic or at planting, if you're not using plastic, and your soil test was testing very high for phosphorus and very high for potassium. In this case, a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio of fertilizer like a 10-10-10 or 20-to-20-20 would work. If you have any other scenario in your nutrient management plan that you're working with, this 1-to-1 ratio of fertilizer is no longer adequate. You need to think about some other things, about some blends or some other sources to make sure you're putting out the right amount of nutrients for your specific crop. One, so you don't limit your fertilizer applied to that crop, which can hurt yield and or quality, but also so you're not over applying and wasting money and inadvertently driving up your overall soil test values, especially for phosphorus. In this case, we're looking at our recommendations for broccoli. Again, the question comes, can I just go buy a 1-to-1 ratio of fertilizer or a 20-20-20 or say a 10-10-10 to meet my broccoli needs? And the answer is yes, in one specific case, one specific scenario. Now this scenario does meet more of our overall soil test values that we typically see. However, the same thing applies. The 20-20-20 fertilizer is okay if you are applying about half of your nitrogen at planting, and your soil test was medium for phosphorus and medium for potassium. Then that 1-to-1 is okay. But as we typically do see, we again have high or often have very high soil phosphorus concentrations. So this is another good chance where you could switch your blend to something else to really put out less phosphorus, or another way to look at it is to put out more potassium to better meet your overall nutrient management planning needs and not depend on these standard 1-to-1-to-1 ratio fertilizers. So to demonstrate a few of these different concepts we've talked about, we'll talk about a study we did here on the Eastern Shore regarding fresh market tomato production using plasticulture and looking at some different potassium as well as some sulfur additions to see how that might overall increase yields and or quality on these coastal plain sandy loam soils. So the first study here is looking at a low soil test potassium field, which needed somewhere around 240 kilograms of K2O per hectare, or to make that into English terms, about 200 pounds of potash per acre, versus a high soil test field, which only called for 112 kilograms per hectare of K2O, or about 100 pounds of K2O per acre. So again, significantly different fertilizer needs, which again lends to this concept of we need different fertilizer ratios and different fertilizer blends to really apply what the crop needs versus just what we can easily just buy off the store shelf. In addition, both of these studies had sulfur additions. This is much higher than we would recommend, but this was the fertilizer source we were testing. It was a high sulfur containing product. But nonetheless, we hopefully will see some benefits to adding sulfur to these crop production systems. So our treatment structure is pretty simple. We looked at a control that basically had no potassium, no sulfur, and it just contained nitrogen and phosphorus. We had a muriate of potash or MOP blend, which was just traditional muriate of potash or KCl fertilizer, along with some nitrogen and some sulfur. A muriate of potash blend with some additions of calcium, and then a polyhalite blend, which is a naturally occurring fertilizer material, which contained potassium, magnesium, calcium, and sulfur. And so let's not focus too much on these different products. So this study was conducted using a plastic mulch fertilizer system here on the Eastern Shore. a traditional system where we have our plastic mulch covering the bed. Prior to laying plastic, we had incorporated a cold mix, which was a 6-3-12 nitrogen, phosphate, and potash fertilizer, with also 15% sulfur and 3% magnesium is our blend. And then we also made another blend, which was our surface band, which was halfway between the drip tape and the side of the bed, which was 11% nitrogen, 4% phosphate, 7% potash, 11% sulfur, and 3% magnesium. So this was the overall fertilizer system and crop production system we were using. And what we found was that, yes, we did see some benefits to fertilizer here on the shore, of course, which we had hoped to see. But more importantly, we did see some benefits to adding sulfur and also magnesium in addition to what we would typically add for lime here on the eastern shore. So initially, this overall was being looked at as a potassium fertilizer product, and we found that somewhere around 180 pounds of K2O or so per acre gave us our highest yields, which were somewhere between, say, 55 and 65,000 pounds of marketable tomato fruit per acre. But one thing we did note was that if you start looking at these blends with sulfur, that sulfur did increase yields pretty much in all cases with our fertilizer sources. So depending on rate, our sulfur plots were somewhere, with 5 to say 10,000 or so pounds more per acre simply by adding sulfur to our fertilizer blend. In addition, magnesium was not as clear cut. We didn't see it at lower potassium rates, but at higher potassium rates, we did see a benefit to magnesium as well. So certainly this is something we're still working on, but nonetheless, some things that we're seeing pull through as far as like wheat and corn are also looking promising, especially for sulfur for some of these vegetable crops as well. So we need to make sure we have a focus on those when we're thinking about crop production. But one final thing I wanted to talk about here was the second study where we're looking at some different fertilizer additives, again with plastic mulch and fresh market tomatoes. So these particular products were specifically intended to be applied in small amounts, saying that they were adequate as larger amounts of fertilizer. And this is just one thing I wanted to hit home was there really is no substitute for a good fertilizer program. That even though one product might be more efficient per se, meaning all of that product might end up in the plant, it is still key to make sure you're putting down enough nutrient to meet our crop production needs, especially for these high-yielding vegetable crops. So for instance, product 1 here had about 2 pounds of nitrogen and 6.6 pounds of phosphate per acre, and product 2 had 2.6 pounds of nitrogen, 8.6 pounds of phosphate, and 0.7 pounds of sulfur per acre. And so going through all the gyration, the data analysis, looking at this particular crop, we found that as we expected, nothing was statistically significant. So even in these crop production systems, which we did have being slightly nutrient deficient, so we could hopefully tease out some results, there was no difference by adding just very small or minuscule amounts of these macronutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and sulfur, because we didn't put out enough to really make a meaningful difference. So overall, we've talked a little bit about different blends, different fertilizers, and some things to think about, and not just to go to the shelf and buy, say, a 10-10-10 or 20-20-20 fertilizer, because there's a lot of different options out there, and there's a lot of different blends, if you're a larger producer especially, that you can get made on a field-specific basis to really match what you need for your particular soil test. So Coincidentally, earlier this year in 2020, when we were first quarantined, I sat down and I made some new publications that really focused on some of the most common fertilizer sources that we do have here available to us in Virginia, to really showcase all the different choices that we could use for our different fertilizer blends, whether it's a liquid or a dry granular product. So again, to find this publication, you can go to your favorite search engine and query VCE for Virginia Cooperative Extension publication. And in this case, this is a pub that focuses on common macro fertilizers like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And this is pub SPES-199NP. And we have all kind of different products listed here. So if you're looking for some different products to test, to try out, this is a good place to go and look for some different ideas. And everything that we have listed here should be readily available here in Virginia. Maybe not at your supplier, but through a supplier for our particular farming needs. In addition, a question we receive a lot is about some, say, secondary nutrients and micro fertilizers that are commonly available. So we also have another publication, which is SPES or SPES 200NP, which focuses on nutrients like calcium and sulfur and magnesium, boron, and molybdenum. Some other nutrients that you might want to consider or might need for your vegetable production systems. And finally, with every good nutrient management plan and fertilizer calculation, is you're probably going to need at some point in time to bounce between different conversions, such as changing phosphorus to phosphate, P to P2O5, and so forth. And so if you look at publication SPES 201NP, this publication has some common conversion factors that might be useful for you as well when you're looking at your nutrient management plans and fertilizer calculations. So with that, I thank you for hanging with me over this time. Just a few take-home messages here. I want to stress that we really need to start focusing on using appropriate fertilizer ratios for your needs that are based on your soil tests and your crop production system. Certainly, in select cases, these 1-1-1 ratio fertilizers like 10-10-10 and 20-20-20 might be useful, but there's a lot of other different options out there as well that really lets you hone in on putting out what you need for your particular crop. In addition, make sure you put out enough fertilizer to matter. We need so much nitrogen, so much sulfur, and so forth to make the amino acids, to build the proteins, to make our fruit that we sell to market. So certainly, physiologically, you need that nutrient to make it happen. So you can't skimp on these nutrients by using these, say, high efficient fertilizers. You have to make sure enough of the product is out there and is available to meet our overall crop potential. And finally, one thing we're working on, and I just want y'all to be aware of, is that we need to develop and further develop these magnesium, sulfur, calcium recommendations for vegetable crops. And we are working on it. So with that, if you start seeing some chlorosis or yellowing in the top of your crop plants, certainly make sure that sulfur is included in your system somewhere. You know, somewhere upwards of, depending on your crop production system, your soil, how much that plant can retrieve from soil organic matter as it cycles and so forth, you might need to add, say, 15 to 50 pounds of sulfur per acre. It really is dependent on your particular system. But nonetheless, it's something we need to be cognizant about and to think about when growing crops. So as always, feel free to call me with or email me with information. Email your local or call your local extension agent as well, and they can reach out to me or help you find the best solution, especially regarding fertilizer for your particular system. Also, if you're interested in, say, Facebook, you can certainly follow our page here on the Eastern Shore, at the Eastern Shore AREC, is from time to time we post some things that might be informative to producers here in Virginia, especially as they relate to vegetable crops. And finally, I just want to point out the extension publication for soil test boxes and soil test information forms. We've changed those a little bit over the past few years, and now certainly make sure you're using a form with email so you can get your results more quickly. So with that, I thank you for your time. I look forward to hearing from you as far as questions, and go Hokies.